All right, folks, welcome back to another great episode of Dr. J Radio Live. Of course, I'm your host, Dr. J, broadcasting from the City of Demons. That's right, you heard me correctly, City of Demons, not City of Angels anymore. La La Land, Hollywood, whatever you want to call it. And of course, as you know, we've been running 7 years strong. And today's show, I haven't told you the guest's name up until yesterday. The reason is because sometimes something happens last minute, but now we got the guest on. And of course, if you have read his bio, see that there's one clue right there. It's a he. He's been speaking for over 2 decades, to say the least. Written over 20 books, if I'm not mistaken. A new documentary about him. So much more. I'll let him explain. Without further ado, the one and only David Icke. David, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much. It's 30 years now.
30 years.
30 years I've been on this road of uncovering what the those in authority worldwide does not want to be uncovered. So yeah, it's been a long journey.
Let me ask you this. When did you realize that the public as a whole were being lied to about everything?
Well, from a small boy, I was always questioning of authority, whether it was teachers at school or whatever. My kind of way of looking at life is don't tell me to respect what you say and respect what you do just because of who you are. What you do and what you say should be the arbiter of whether I respect what you're doing and saying. So I've never kind of bowed to authority, and I've always, said, okay, well, where authority makes sense, okay, fair enough, but often it doesn't. So I've challenged it, and I've been doing it all my life. And so I've always been skeptical of authority in the sense that, life experience shows you that again and again, authority misleads. And in terms of, government and what's known as the deep state these days, they outright lie to you day after day after day. And people lie to you for a simple reason. They don't want you to know the truth because the truth is bad for them and what they want to they want to do, the agendas they're following. So basically, when people talk about conspiracy theorists, this is a tag that was actually brought into widespread use by the CIA in 1967 when it was urging media organizations in America to use the term conspiracy theorists and conspiracy theory to discredit those who were questioning the ludicrous official story of the Kennedy assassination. And now it's used as a term of dismissal, always a conspiracy theorist. But what is a conspiracy? Well, not theorist. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I'm a conspiracy researcher. What are
Yes.
they actually saying? They're saying that authority lies to us. Now, is there anyone on planet Earth who's not accept that authority lies to us? Well, I've got some seafront property in the Midwest for sale if they believe that. So what I do is, and I've done for 30 years, is say, okay, this is what authority is saying about this situation or whatever. Let's see if it stands up. And you investigate it, and you investigate the background, and you invariably find that it doesn't stand up because authority lies to us. But it really came to a head for me about 30 years ago now, 1990, when I started on a journey of enormous synchronicity, shall we say, where my life was clearly pushed in a particular direction. And over the years that followed, I just started compiling and coming across enormous amounts of information around the world, not just in one country, which together showed that the world is not controlled by the forces and powers and people that it appears to be. And in fact, there's a permanent government, which is always there, and the political parties and politicians and presidents and prime ministers are just here today, gone tomorrow people that give the public the impression that they're choosing who rules them when actually the permanent government is always there, no matter which party or rosette color or complexion of party is in power. I came across a phrase in America a long time ago when I first went there among people who actually did have some idea of what was going on. And they said it doesn't matter who you vote for because the government still gets in. And it does, and it's the permanent government which is always there. So I've been investigating and exposing that now for 30 years. And what's happened is it's gone from widespread dismissal and this guy's crazy, how can he say this, to now widespread acceptance that actually there's big time something in this. And that's led to this new book, The Trigger, which uh, goes in with enormous detail into who actually was behind 9/11, and it wasn't 19 Islamic hijackers, and why. And it opens up the door not just to the 9/11 story, but to the fact that the same network that was behind 9/11 is also behind what's going on in the world to this day.
I'm really glad you brought up 9/11 for a couple reasons. First of all, there's so much crap revolving that topic. I remember watching it that day live. I was watching BBC and they showed the Solomon Brothers building collapse. I went to see downstairs where the rest of the family was watching, and they were watching ABC. And you see a building completely gone. I went back upstairs to where BBC was on, and it took 20 minutes. It's like, how did they know? Clearly, it sounded scripted. And of course, you mentioned the 19 hijackers. From what I found out from a flight attendant, is that some of them were actually Saudi air pilots, Saudi Air, the airlines.
Yeah, well, there's so many things that come from that. I mean, in the trigger, it's written in two parts. The first part takes the official story of 9/11 to pieces, completely dismantles it, because there's not one area of the 9/11 official story that actually plays out as true. And the second half tells an amazing story, which eventually leads to who actually was behind it. But if we take the Salomon Brothers building alone to start with, which is also known as Building 7, what's interesting is that if you say to, it's still most people, how many buildings collapsed on 9/11? They'll say two, the Twin Towers. And I quote in the book a judge in a court in America who was overseeing a 9/11 related case. And it was in 2009, this case. And at one point, Building 7 was mentioned. And he asked basically, Building what? Building 7? What's Building 7? Even he didn't know there'd been three. But one of the major reasons that people don't know that there was three, well, a number of reasons. One of them is it was not hit by an aircraft. It was a 47-story steel frame building, and it fell at 5:20 in the afternoon, not having been hit by a plane. So, because it happened after the focus of attention of the attacks meant that it was less covered. But there's another reason why it was not covered, and that is that it is the most obvious, blatant, controlled demolition you'll ever see. We see from time to time footage of controlled demolition teams, companies, bringing down stadiums and skyscrapers, and they go in, and for weeks before, they are putting in the charges in exactly the right place so that the building doesn't topple over and hit buildings all around it, but actually collapses on its own footprint. This is the whole raison d'etre, if you like, of controlled demolition. Well, if people go who haven't come across Building 7, if they go onto YouTube and put in Building 7 collapse 9/11, they will see the most blatant controlled demolition you'll ever see. And I quote in the book a list of building experts, engineers, and architects who all say that is controlled demolition, including some people who are actually in the controlled demolition business. The reason this is important and the reason that it's the whole Building 7 situation is downplayed is because it is a massive Achilles heel of the 9/11 official story, because it's the most blatant lie. We are told, I know it's incredible, but if people look at the official story of 9/11, it won't be the only incredible thing they'll see. The official government story, official, of why Building 7 fell was a office furnishings fire. That's the official story. And that means that Building 7 is the only steel frame building in the entirety of architectural building history, before or since, that has fallen because of fire.
Furniture fire at that. Not
A
even an
furniture
explosion.
fire.
Yeah.
Unbelievable. I mean, how the guy who announced it to a press conference did it without laughing or apologizing, I don't know, but he did. Anyway, another person said that it was a controlled demolition, and he wished he hadn't, because he's had to live with it ever since.
Larry Silverstein, you mean, right?
Larry Silverstein, who owned Building 7 and then bought the lease weeks before 9/11 of the Twin Towers. And he said in a PBS documentary retrospective of 9/11 that the fire chief had come to him, a fire chief, by the way, who's never, ever come forward and identified himself. Why? Because the whole conversation was made up. But anyway, Silverstein said this fire chief came to him, fire commander, and said that the fire in Building 7, office furnishings, was not difficult to keep under control. Actually, as a group called Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, building and architects and building engineers and building experts who came together after 9/11 to make the point, and they're still going strong, that the official story of how the buildings fell is ridiculous and in terms of engineering, absolutely unsustainable. They were immediately saying that Building 7 was a controlled demolition. And so here's Larry Silverstein saying that the Building 7 was burning out of control when architects and engineers point out from their own research the fire was out by the time the building came down, as it would be with an office furnishings fire, for goodness sake. And he said that he agreed with the fire commander that there'd been such a loss of life during the day that they would pull the building. And he said, we made the decision to pull it and then shortly afterwards watch the building come down. Well, there's a few things for that. First of all, fire commanders do not demolish buildings. Controlled demolition experts do. And secondly, it takes weeks to put the charges in the right places to make the building fall on its own footprint. So Silverstein was lying, and the whole story of 9/11, Building 7 was a lie, as indeed 9/11 itself. And here's the point. You'll remember that Boy Bush and Dick Cheney resisted as vehemently as they could any official investigation into 9/11. Unbelievable. 3,000 people dead, a massive attack on American soil, and they were resisting any investigation. Why? Because they didn't want people to find out what had really happened. Anyway, pressure from the public led them to have to agree to it. And then they appoint Henry Kissinger, a man who you know when he's lying because his lips are moving, as head of the commission. This proved to be so ludicrous that he had to stand down. And they brought in other people, not least a guy called Philip Zelikow, a Bush administration insider with many other connections to 9/11 as well, to become the executive director of the commission. He basically wrote the report, decided what went in it, decided what didn't go in it. But he's faced here, you see, with a big problem with Building 7, because Building 7 is the most blatantly obvious controlled demolition. And, putting in a report, official report, that it fell because of office furnishings fire would simply be untenable. It would be taken apart. So the way they got around it is 3 buildings fell on 9/11, but the 9/11 Commission report only talks about two.
Well,
Completely ignored Building 7, didn't mention it. That's how they got away with it. And in the trigger, it's just an explosion of facts that show that the official story is impossible. For instance, many other things. The the first thing that pilot's supposed to do when there's a hijack is punch in a 4-digit code, and it goes bang, 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 bang. That's as long as it takes to do. That's the first thing they're meant to do when there's a hijack. Not one of the 9/11 planes punched in the hijack code, and no one's ever explained why. Well, people might get a better idea if they read the trigger. How many people know, not only don't know about Building 7, but how many people among the general public know that on that day of all days, there was a, quote, unprecedented number of war game scenarios, practice exercises going on in the skies where the 9/11 planes were being hijacked, that were being run by the Air Force and the military to practice scenarios around plane hijackings. And one of these scenarios, and there was a long list of them, like unprecedented number on one day. One of them was a scenario in which a plane hit a building in Washington. It was the National Reconnaissance Office. And as I show in the trigger, these war games had their planes and their simulated planes as part of the war exercise, the hijack exercise. Those blips, real planes and simulated planes in the exercises, were all on the screens of air traffic controllers and NORAD, the military Air Force response system to hijacks. And I published some of the tapes of the responders, and they were confused, as they were meant to be. That's why this happened. They were confused about whether these 9/11 hijacking reports that were coming in were actually part of the exercise, or whether they were real or not. And these simulated blips on the screens were causing enormous confusion. What's real and what isn't? And at one point, someone shouts on one of the tapes, "Get rid of the goddamn sim," because they call it sim over live, simulated planes over live planes. And so there was complete and utter confusion. Another thing that is worth mentioning is that General Ralph Eberhardt, who was the head of NORAD, which is the military Air Force response system to hijackings and threats to America from the air, and Canada as well. He was the one that decided that this unprecedented number of exercises would be going on in the 9/11 skies that day. And he was also the man 12 hours before the hijackings who put the military Pentagon computer protection system onto its lowest level of protection. And through the book, I'm adding things and adding things and adding things to this picture. Extraordinary stories and ineptitude, I say systematic ineptitude, which shows the 9/11 story to be utter garbage. For instance, Washington is a no-fly zone. Of course it is. It has a no-fly area. It's called P56. And if you enter that no-fly zone, then if you're not emitting the right code, then if you are seen to be a threat to Washington, you're shot from the sky. I quote in the book Caspar Weinberger, a former US Defense Secretary, who said that Washington is circled by air bases, and if anyone enters the no-fly zone, then those bases scramble planes, and the plane it doesn't have the code to be there is blown from the sky if necessary. I also quote people from insiders at the Pentagon who've worked there who say that and why wouldn't it be that the Pentagon and indeed the no-fly zone in general, is defended by ground-to-air missile systems. But on 9/11, we have a plane that flew 40 minutes into the Midwest from Washington Dulles. Then we're told it turned around and flew 40 minutes back and struck the Pentagon. And yet there was no response whatsoever from the military and from NORAD. What they did in the end was to scramble jets from the Langley Air Force Base in Virginia, which is 130 miles from Washington, when 10 miles down the road from the Pentagon is the Andrews Air Force Base, where Air Force One is kept. And nothing was scrambled from there, 10 miles away, to meet the plane that is said to have hit the Pentagon. They scrambled instead from Langley, and too late for them to get to the Pentagon in time. Not only that, the pilots who were scrambled say that they weren't told what they were scrambled for. And so instead of heading to the Pentagon directly, they headed out into the Atlantic, they said, because they thought that the threat was going to come from the sea, because that's what they were trained to do during the Cold War. And again, for New York, they scrambled planes, although for a week, for a week, the official story was no planes were scrambled at all until the Pentagon was hit. That was the official story for a week. And then Dan Rather came out on CBS one night, a week later, and said, we've heard that planes were scrambled from Langley for Washington and from Cape Cod in Massachusetts to the Twin Towers. And suddenly, the officialdom, the Pentagon, and the official story out of the White House that there had been no scramble at all suddenly became, yes, that's right, we did scramble, but we didn't get there in time. The whole story is absolutely littered with lie after lie after lie after lie, because quite clearly 9/11 was made and allowed to happen, both, to justify what has followed, which has been invading Afghanistan, invading, in effect, Libya, causing the catastrophe in Syria, and now the targeting of Iran. And you can show this to be the case because in 1997, an organization was created in America called the Project for the New American Century. The co-founders were two ultra-Zionist Israel firsters called Bill Kristol and Robert Kagan. And in that Project for the New American Century were Dick Cheney, who would be 9/11 de facto president, official vice president, Donald Rumsfeld, who would be the defense secretary at 9/11, Paul Wolfowitz, who would be his deputy defense secretary, Dov Zakheim, who would be the comptroller of the Pentagon in charge of the entire budget, and people like John Bolton, who was until very recently the Trump National Security Advisor. The connection of this to 9/11 is this. In September 2000, this Project for the New American Century issued a document in which it called for American forces to fight and decisively win multiple theater wars to regime change a series of countries. And it named them Iraq, Libya, Syria, Iran, Lebanon, North Korea, leading to regime change eventually in China.
Egypt too, right?
Well, I don't think it mentioned Egypt. It might have done, but they were the key. I don't think it mentioned Egypt, but of course that was regime changed in the Arab Spring. But anyway, the countries that it named are the ones that have been targeted ever since. And the people that wrote that document came to power with Bush a few months later in January 2001. And in that document was a very, very key phrase, a very key point. It said in September 2000, a year to the month before 9/11, that this process of transformation that it called it, in other words, all this regime change that it wanted American forces to bring about, would necessarily be slow, and this is the quote, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor that would justify and bring in support the American public to these regime changes. So what then happened, of course, is a year to the month after that document was published, and 9 months after the people that wrote it came to power with Bush, America had what Bush called at the time our Pearl Harbor, the Pearl Harbor of the 21st century. And as a result of that trigger of 9/11, hence the name of the book, these countries on that list have been picked off ever since. And not only ever since, but under different regimes and different parties. See, it was Republican Bush and the Labour Party Prime Minister in England, Tony Blair, that lied to justify an invasion of Iraq, ticking that off the list. But then they were replaced by a Democrat, Obama, and a Conservative Party in Britain, opposition to Blair's party, Prime Minister called David Cameron, and they oversaw the invasion of Libya to remove Gaddafi, and then what happened to start the catastrophe in Syria. And then they stand aside, and in comes the maverick Trump, who says, I'm different to everybody else, and then you see Iran being targeted, which is another one on the list. So clearly, I mentioned earlier about a permanent government, and you know what I've been writing about for 30 years, and people have said it's crazy. Now, deep state in America, increasingly in Britain, but deep state is actually common parlance now, because it's this deep state that is always there, no matter which party's in power, that is actually driving all this. And it was the deep state in conjunction with Israeli Mossad that was behind 9/11, and actually a secret society that controls the deep state and controls Israeli Mossad was behind 9/11. And I make the case for that with enormous detail. And the official story that it was hijackers orchestrated by Osama bin Laden is absolutely ridiculous. And not only that, you know, Robert Mueller been in the news recently over the Russiagate
yes,
stuff.
special counsel.
Yeah, but he was appointed the head of the FBI 2 weeks before 9/11 happened. And he actually said, when he was questioned about the hijackers, that they could not make a case that would stand up in court against those hijackers, and also that they couldn't make a case against bin Laden. And when I first started investigating 9/11, actually immediately it happened. And I produced a book in 2002 called Alice in Wonderland of the World Trade Center disaster, which was, from my understanding, the first major book to challenge the official story. I was in email correspondence with the Federal Aviation Administration, with the White House, with the Pentagon, and with the FBI. And I remember being in correspondence with a guy called Toom, a FBI spokesman. Was his name Rex Toom for sure. And he actually was quoted when he was asked why on the most wanted page for Osama bin Laden is his list of why he's wanted, why does it not include 9/11? And Toom said, because we have no hard evidence that bin Laden was connected to 9/11. Now, how many people know that? Because the whole thing is a psychological hoax where you keep repeating the same thing over and over again, and it becomes official history, not because it's true, but because it's constantly repeated and all that people ever hear.
After 9/11, the support to go to Iraq to finish what Papa Bush, George Herbert Walker Bush, started with Saddam Hussein was very low after 9/11. But with all the propaganda every single day, hammering it that Iraq, 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 you could literally see the percentage of the people, which was a small population, a small percentage of the U.S. population, and even the world population, the allies of the U.S. that wanted to go there. Yet, by the end of the 2 years, like you said, by completely saying it over and over again, the rise to invade Iraq, the support gained such momentum. It just shows you right there that a lie used as propaganda will get what they want done.
Well, you see, you'll remember that even in the final run up to the invasion of Iraq in the spring of 2003, Bush and certainly Blair in this country was saying if Saddam Hussein would give up his weapons of mass destruction, then we could still stop the invasion. That was a complete lie, because that invasion was planned for years and years and years, and all they were looking for was an excuse. They didn't have a real one, so they had to make one up, and that's where weapons of mass destruction came about. The lie of weapons of mass destruction. It was just an excuse to pick off Iraq from the list. And let me give you a quick sequence. In 1997, the man who is known as the father of Israeli intelligence, a man called Issa Harel, was interviewed by an American journalist, and he said to the American journalist that he thought and predicted that Arab terrorists would target New York's biggest building with a terrorist attack, because he said the biggest building is like a phallic symbol, and to attack that would break the spirit of America. That kind of theme he was talking about. In the same year, 1997, Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel started organizing conferences. First one was in Jerusalem, second one was in America in 1984. He also wrote a book pushing the same thing. And that was the need for fighting a war on terrorism, and to create a situation where you were having preemptive strikes against countries to stop them doing terrorist events, even though they hadn't done them, but to preemptively strike on those countries, just an excuse to regime change. In 1996, Benjamin Netanyahu was prime minister of Israel, and a man called Richard Perle, an American ultra-Zionist friend of Netanyahu, produced a report with others called A Clean Break. This was a report for Netanyahu, the prime minister, saying what Israel needed to do to secure the realm, in the subtitle of the document. And this included removing Saddam Hussein from Iraq, destabilizing countries like Syria, and creating as much inter-Arab conflict as they possibly could. In 1997, the following year, the Project for the New American Century was created by Crystal and by Kagan in the United States. And in 1998, the Project for the New American Century wrote to then President Bill Clinton, urging him to invade Iraq to remove Saddam Hussein. Then came the document in September 2000, followed by the people that wrote it coming to power with Bush, and then came 9/11. And in 2007, General Wesley Clark, very famous general in America, who was at one time Supreme Commander of forces in NATO, he was interviewed on Democracy Now!, an alternative news program. And he described how he went to the Pentagon immediately after 9/11 and met with Rumsfeld, met with Wolfowitz, and then went downstairs to meet a friend of his who was a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the military uniform level of the Pentagon. And he said this general friend said to him, "We're going to invade Iraq." This is days after 9/11. And Clark said, "What are we going to invade Iraq for? Are they connected to 9/11? The general said, "Oh, not that we know of," he said. "But I've been told we're going to invade Iraq." So Clark goes away, comes back a few weeks later, by which time the United States forces are in Afghanistan. And he says to the general, "I thought we were going to invade Iraq." And he said, "It's worse than that, sir." He said, and he picked up a piece of paper and he said, "I've just had this from upstairs, Rumsfeld's office. We're going to invade 7 countries in 5 years." And he reeled them off. And they not only included Iraq, they included all that list of countries from the Project for New American Century from the document a year earlier. And the New York Times also reported just after 9/11 that on September the 19th and 20th, the so-called Pentagon Defense Policy Board and the same people that I've been describing, the Project for the New American Century and people like Kissinger, and Richard Pearl, who'd written that document for Netanyahu in 1996, the New York Times reported that they had met to plot the removal of Saddam Hussein in Iraq. This is days after 9/11. So the idea that they only started the build-up to invade Iraq in 2002, 2003 is absolutely ridiculous. It's an absolute lie. It was the culmination of a long-term plan, but they needed an excuse for it. 9/11 and weapons of mass destruction provided the excuse. And you know, what I'm describing, you see, is the permanent government that's dictating to the here today, gone tomorrow government of political parties. And so the same agenda unfolds. Whoever's in the White House, whoever's in Downing Street, it's the same thing. And it's this deep state, particularly the American deep state and the Israeli deep state, which are basically the same, that was behind 9/11. And the cover story of 19 Islamic hijackers was to hide who really did it.
Now, let me ask you this. Who do you think is the deep state? Who do you think's running the US and the UK and other countries? Because we do know that the Republican presidents are also very good friends with the Democratic presidents. For instance, the Clinton and the Bushes, they hang out together all the time. I mean, it's bullocks is what I see. And
Yeah, absolutely.
so, in your opinion, who do you think's running everything?
Well, this is a long and amazing story, but I'll shorten it as much as I can. But all the detail is in the book. The web of human control goes back a long time. It goes way back, centuries and centuries. But you can pick up the group that was really behind 9/11 in the 17th century.
Wow.
And a man called Sabbatai Zevi. Sabbatai Zevi was a Sephardic Jewish man, but he wasn't Jewish. This is the point. He was anti-Jewish. He claimed to be the Jewish Messiah in the 17th century. And he created a cult which eventually had 1 million followers. And all that I'm going to say in the next 2 or 3 minutes is all come from Jewish sources, by the way. There are some people in the Jewish community that absolutely know this is true and have written about it. And Zevi operated in the Ottoman Empire, the Islamic Empire, and at one point he was in Turkey, which was the center of the Ottoman Empire. And the Sultan gave him a ultimatum: you either convert to Islam or you're not going to be around for very long. So he converts to Islam. But the point was, it was only a conversion and his followers converting to Islam on the surface. In the shadows, in private, they were continuing their religion. And their religion was not Judaism. It was something that became known because of his name as Sabbateanism. And what it was an absolute 100% inversion of the Jewish religion. For instance, if there was a particular day in the Jewish religion that was a fasting day, then in Sabbateanism, it would be a feasting day. Now, that seems okay. Okay, they've just switched that, all right. But this inversion meant things that were far more profound. For instance, if the Jewish religion had a taboo of sex with children and incest, then Sabbateanism not only didn't have it as a taboo, they encouraged it. And the whole foundation of Sabbateanism, that whole sales pitch, if you like, was that the more evil you do, the quicker God will come and sort the world out. It was basically called redemption through sin. The more evil you did, the better it was. That's the whole foundation of Sabbateanism. So what happened is these Sabbateans who converted to Islam only on the surface, they became known as Donma or Donme, which means to turn, to convert. And these Donma operated as Sabbateans, which is basically a Satanism death cult, basically what it is. And those Donma, as I show in the book, some of those Donma eventually, they all operated within the Islamic religion as interlopers, and eventually they became the royal family of Saudi Arabia. And in turn, as this unfolded, the British Empire and the House of Saud, which became the Saudi royal family, they were Donma, interlopers, Sabbateans. They came together to produce Saudi Arabia. And another person that was brought in to the Saudi fold by the British, the Sabbatean fold, was another Sabbatean, and his name, who was outwardly proclaiming to be Islamic, and his name was Wahhab, and he is the source of Wahhabism, which is the extreme form of Islam practiced in Saudi Arabia, the head chopping, hand chopping form of ISIS, Islamic State, Islam. It was a creation of this Sabbatean cult. The Sabbatean cult also was behind the creation of Israel. The vast majority of Jewish people have no idea about this, but some do, as these are the sources I'm quoting. And so they created Israel. They also moved in on America. They created what's known in America as Christian Zionism, for instance. And the whole thing became a global network. And this is why Israel, which has 8 million people on a sliver of land, has so much power and influence worldwide. The Jewish population of the world, people will be surprised to hear this, is 0.2%. 0.2%. And if you, depending on how you define what a Jewish person is, you take a mean figure between the different definitions, There's about 16 million Jewish people in the world in a population of 7.7 billion. And to show you just how few we're talking about in terms of this cult, I'm talking about a tiny fraction of the 0.2% and a tiny fraction of the 16 million. And even they are not Jewish. They are anti-Jewish. They're the inversion of Jewish called Sabbateans. And in the 18th century, another man came along called Jacob Frank, who was a Sephardic Jewish man, but wasn't. He was a Sabbatean. And he took Sabbateanism onto an even greater depth of depravity. He's been described by Jewish historians as it was to the effect of one of the most evil people that's ever been in Jewish society. And he claimed to be the reincarnation of this guy, Zabbatai Zevi, and also a reincarnation of the biblical patriarch Jacob. And he, in the 1800s, got together with a guy called Mayer Amschel Rothschild, the founder of the Rothschild dynasty. And they got together with a man called Adam Weishaupt, who was a Jewish man who converted to Roman Catholicism. Now, this is the classic behavior of Sabbateans, because what happened particularly when Jacob Frank got involved and took over the cult, is that they targeted the Roman Catholic Church and claimed to be converting into the Roman Catholic Church while being Sabbateans. This is how they took over the Vatican. And Adam Weishaupt, in league with Jacob Frank, this Sabbatean Frankist as it became known, and Mayer Amschel Rothschild, created what is now called the Illuminati in 1776. And the Bible of Sabbatean Frankists, this death cult, is the Kabbalah, the mystical works of the Jewish community, the Jewish belief system, and particularly a book in the Kabbalah called the Zohar. And the Zohar, the word Zohar, means radiance or illumination, and that's where Illuminati comes from. And this Illuminati then expanded across the world and into America. And that's the force that was behind 9/11. That's the force behind all these attempted regime changes in the Middle East. That's the force behind whoever's in power in America, whoever's in power in Britain, et cetera, et cetera. And it's an extraordinary, I repeat again and emphasize, the sources that I quote in the book in support of all this are all Jewish sources who have understood from within their own community how their community, Jewish community, has been taken over by this cult while posing as members of that community, which is classic Sabbateanism because they're interlopers. They appear to be one thing while pursuing a very different agenda in private.
Clearly lying to us. Let me read you a quote from your book. This is page 820. The subtitle is The Internet of Things. It seems like only yesterday that I was warning about the plan for the Pentagon/CIA/hidden hand-driven Internet of Things, to which all technology would be connected. Everything from household appliances to television to vehicles, and once again, everything. We are living in that state right now. Constantly we're being monitored. Is anything going to get better? I mean, what else can we do to wake people up?
Well, what's got to happen is people have got to appreciate what's driving it. If you don't know what's driving it, then you have this situation where things are happening, but you don't know what to target. And what I just described, this cult, it's behind the Internet of Things. It's behind the smart grid. It's behind 5G. It's about behind the plan articulated from Silicon Valley, which this cult controls, by the way, that by 2030, we're going to have the human brain start to be connected to artificial intelligence. So artificial intelligence becomes the human mind. This is all being orchestrated by the same death cult that I've just described and reveal and expose in great detail in The Trigger. And you see, what they've got now is a situation by controlling Silicon Valley and controlling the information, which is basically the vast majority of information now that people see worldwide that comes through Silicon Valley, comes through Facebook, comes through Google, etc. They control both what they are doing and they control that which can suppress the exposure of what they're doing. I'll give you a personal example from this very day. The Trigger was published officially, and it's now in ever increasingly widespread circulation. There's been enormous interest in the book. Just a few days. And today, just a few days in, Facebook has gone back through my page history, found ludicrous excuses to give me strikes, and have told us today that we are now on the verge of being deleted, that my page on Facebook is on the verge of being deleted.
Jeez.
Now, they've done this in the last 24 hours, 48 hours, because they want to stop circulation of this information that I'm talking about. I mean, Facebook is owned by this Sabbatean Frankist cult. So is Google. And these people like Page and Brin and Zuckerberg, they're just front men. They don't really control what those organizations do. I mean, my Facebook page had reached about 750,000 followers by about 4 or 5 years ago. And it was going up by 3,000-4,000 a week. By now, it should be millions. It's still 740,000 because overnight they stopped the numbers increasing. The same is done to me on YouTube. When someone interviews me who's got their own channel, the numbers go through the roof because the YouTube algorithms have not tracked that particular site in relation to me. My videos go out and they don't get anything like what other sites get when they interview me because the algorithms are locking my channel down. I did a series of interviews on publication day, September the 11th, with a channel called London Real, which gets a lot of big numbers. And it's got enormous numbers for previous interviews with me. But the recommendation system of YouTube, whereby you go into a site and then you start getting recommended videos from that site, that's all been locked down in terms of the interviews that I did with this channel a few days ago. They're not recommending them at all. And when you go to the channel's recommendations, it's recommending videos on that site, none of them of which are mine and recent, because they're trying to lock down this information. So this is what we have, a situation where those that are behind this have control of what they're doing and control of the suppression of exposure of what they're doing. And that's why I wrote this book. I say in part of the book, I wrote this book as like sticking an arm through an elevator door just as the two doors are closing, because that's what's happening to human freedom. And what I've done is pull no punches and told it like it is, and the consequences will have to take care of themselves. Because if we don't start exposing this, then human freedom is heading for the rocks very fast.
In some way, we have already lost a lot of freedoms, especially here in the United States. Yeah. After 9/11, I mean, it seems like, of course, they want a Pearl Harbor type event so they can have support to go after Iraq and all these other countries you mentioned. But at the same time, they're stripping away our civil rights, our freedom. Is there any way for us to reverse this?
Well, the way to reverse it is to stop self-censoring, because that's what's happening now. You know, I've said in the book, and I've said many times, when I'm communicating information, I do it on the basis of whether I believe it to be true and whether I can factually support what I'm saying. I do not, when I'm putting information out, ask the question, what are the consequences for me? Because once you start doing that, consequences will persuade you that it's best if you don't put it out, you don't say it, you don't write it, except you don't do it. And we have to stop this self-censorship, which is going on all the time. Political correctness is simpler, which this cult is behind, by the way, goes back to an organization called the Frankfurt School in Frankfurt, Germany, the home city of the Rothschilds. They are behind the political correctness, which is manipulating the target population to silence itself. That's what political correctness is. And all this deletion of freedom is part of this gathering global dictatorship that I've been warning about for 30 years. And it's part of this process of deleting and deleting and deleting what people can say and communicate, because every time there's more deletion, there's less opportunity to expose what this cult is doing. And the point being is this: there is an end game, and we are heading into it fast. And the end game, the more we go into it, becomes more and more obvious in terms of A, what they're doing, and B, who's actually doing it. And so as we move into that, there has to be more and more and more suppression of freedom of speech and communication, because there's more and more potential for people to see it and communicate it. Hey, look what's going on. Look who's behind it. So what they're doing is shutting that down. It's all systematic, because the world is controlled by a web, a spider's web. And in the center is the spider, deep in the shadows, that's dictating events. And you come out from the spider, you go through all the secret societies around the spider, and then you come out eventually into the public arena. And in the public arena, Silicon Valley seems to be different from Amazon, seems to be different from the banking system, from the pharmaceutical cartel, from the print and televisual media, seems to be different from government and from corporations of other kinds, food corporations, etc. But if you go back to the spider in the center of the web, all those different organizations are connected to the spider. So at that level, Silicon Valley, Facebook, Google, Twitter is Amazon, is the government, is the Pentagon, is the big pharma, etc., etc. And if you look at the censorship process of the internet monopolistic corporations, not least Facebook and YouTube, owned by Google, you find that the censorship is in protection of all these organizations of which they are a part. So they attack people exposing the conspiracy. They attack people and censor people exposing 9/11. They attack and suppress people exposing the consequences for children of vaccines, etc. This is how it works. Silicon Valley is an expression of the spider. So is Big Pharma. So is the government. So is the Pentagon. So is Mossad. So is the CIA. And thus, they all work as one unit if you go deep enough in these organizations. But of course, the vast majority of people that work for these organizations have no idea that these connections actually are happening.
Now, this hour's flown by, and I'm very, very honored to have you on, as are the listeners. They're absolutely digging what you're saying, and they have a lot of questions, which we'll take next time. Let me
Yeah,
ask.
I'd love to come back again and take questions. That would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, let me ask you these two final things together, and then please hang by afterwards for a quick moment. First of all, what is next for you? And second of all, if you have one final statement for everybody out there globally, what would you say?
Well, first of all, where I go from here, my next book is going to be all about solutions and all about how we take our power back, because that is vital now. And that I'm going to write that very quickly because it's all coming out of me after 30 years of experience of all this. And secondly, I would I would say this: don't underestimate the scale of lies that authority, ultimately deep in the shadows, controlled by this death cult, is willing to tell you. Don't think they would never do that. They would never lie that much, because that's the one of the big defense mechanisms that this cult has. It's that what it is doing is so fantastic compared with what people would perceive anyone would do, that people dismiss what's actually happening by the fact that it's too fantastic. What's that line we hear all the time? They would never do that. And I've heard it in terms of 9/11, people saying, "Oh no, they'd never do that." No, you would never do that. They would not only do it, not only did do it, but would get sexually high on the suffering, the mayhem, and the catastrophe that followed. We're not dealing with people like you and me. We're dealing with people that make psychopaths look like Mary Poppins.
That's
And
sad.
in terms of lies, let me leave you with this one. The quote, extremist Islamic pilot that was supposed to have flown Flight 77 into the Pentagon. I say a plane didn't hit it, and I explain why afterwards. But who was supposed to? It's a guy called Annie Henshaw. Annie Henshaw is supposed to have flown this this big commercial plane, a 757, and flown it into Washington and produced a staggering spiral turn that I quote pilots in the book who've actually flown those planes as saying, I couldn't do that. And to have hit the Pentagon in a way and at a level and angle that these pilots say impossible. And Annie Henshaw was supposed to have done that. Annie Henshaw was banned from hiring a one-engine plane at a small airport 6 weeks before 9/11 because the people said he was so incompetent and dangerous, we were not going to let him fly in our aircraft, a one-engine plane. So that's the scale of lies that they're prepared to tell you. And they think two things. One, if we repeat it often enough, people will believe it. And two, most people will never check the facts. Well, the facts are checked in incredible detail in the trigger. And anyone who reads it will never see 9/11 or the world in the same way ever again.
With the Pentagon, what's really crazy about it is where is the wreckage? You don't see bodies, you don't see luggage, you don't see anything on that lawn. It's really sad.
Well, let me just say something finally about that. And again, it will go on to what I've just said. I say in the book, and I produce the evidence to support that the planes that left the airports were not the planes that crashed. They were replaced by drones flown from the ground. A technology, not only was it available and very highly advanced in 2001, it was being used in the 1950s. So what I say is, well, let's take the Pentagon, first of all. People say the authorities say a plane hit the Pentagon, and anyone that questions that is a conspiracy theorist and a nutter and shouldn't be taken seriously. Okay, there were 84, 85 surveillance cameras in and around the Pentagon on 9/11. Show us the footage, because a very serious number of them would have caught the plane very clearly. Show us the footage. Why have you never shown us the footage? The camera footage was confiscated by the FBI, the chief investigation non-investigation agency, on 9/11, and we've never seen it since. But also, to prove that the planes that left the airports were the ones that crashed is very, very simple. In every crash, no matter what it is, the air crash investigators establish that the plane crashed is the plane they think crashed by taking the parts that have survived, and they take their serial number and they go to the maintenance log of the planes, because every time parts are put on a plane, either new or replaced, those part serial numbers go on the maintenance log. So what they do is they take the parts code, they check it off against the maintenance log, they see that it's the same, and they say, yes, this is the plane we think it is. That has only been not done once, to my knowledge, and that was in the wake of 9/11. And I know this for a fact because someone applied through the Freedom of Information Act to the FBI to produce the documentation that showed that they had checked the surviving part codes with the maintenance logs of the planes to prove they were the planes that left the airports. And the reply from the FBI was that that process was not done with any of the planes, and their excuse was because the identity of the planes was never in doubt. If you read the trigger, the identity of those planes that hit buildings and crashed in Pennsylvania were absolutely in doubt, and very much in doubt, but they never checked it. And another thing, very early on in my exposure of all this, I wrote books, and I included somewhere called Iron Mountain, Pennsylvania. Iron Mountain is an absolutely top secret inside mountain base where very, very sensitive documents, material of all kinds is kept, where no one will ever see it that they don't want to see it. It's top secret, Iron Mountain. There was a book came out years and years ago in the early days of my research called Report from Iron Mountain, which was exposing that. The remains of the plane that is said to have been Flight 93 not only was not checked against the maintenance logs, but is now kept at Iron Mountain, this top secret place that hides what they don't want the public to see.
Huh. Very
Why are they
interesting.
doing that? Why are they doing that? Because they're hiding the truth. And the truth is the official story of 9/11 is an absolute joke and an insult to those who died and their loved ones left behind.
It is. It's an insult. It's a lie. It's bullocks. It's everything you want to call it. I mean, if you wanted to cuss at it, I mean, every element of deceit is there. The one and only David Icke, folks. This has been an incredible interview. We will do this again. I promise all you people who are writing questions in the chat next time, we will have time to interact with Mr. Icke.
Yeah, let's do it next time. We'll do the questions.
Yeah. Now, real quick, before you go, after I want to speak to you for a quick second, but let's tell people where they can see the movie I believe it's The Renegade, as well as
Renegade.
buy The Trigger and all your other books.
Well, they can get both from davidicke.com. We don't post the books from Britain. They are sent to people from within the United States, so you're going to get it very, very quickly. And Renegade is also available via davidicke.com. You can buy it or you can just rent it and just watch it. It's 90 minutes. I think it's 90 minutes, something like that. That's about my life, yes, but it's about the information with my life just as a backdrop. And it's if anyone wants to come across it or is coming across this information for the first time, it's a very, very good introduction. If someone, people listening obviously are interested in it, but if they know people like family or whatever that are new to it and like, what's this all about? It's a fabulous introduction to the information.
Well said. The one and only David Icke, folks. Again, this is Dr. J, host of Dr. J Radio Live, and check the website for further updates on shows. And of course, as you heard Mr. Icke, we will be back for him to answer your questions because there are a lot of them. With that being said, be sure to read The Trigger, watch The Renegade. Fantastic film. And with that being said, now we are signing up.
What
Oh,
now?
yes.
Hello, I'm David Icke, and you're listening to Dr. J Radio Live.